United we're as strong as a mountain.
Liz Medina, I'm the Executive Director of Vermont State Labor Council, and I'm really glad that we are having this discussion today because wars and conflict affect working people everywhere, usually quite negatively. And I think there's been a lot of media noise and censorship around the Ukraine conflict, and it's kind of dampened debate among working people and the left too, because it's really hard to understand what's going on. And I'm not going to go into too much of the context for the war, though it is deep and complex, going back many, many years. Some, started at the Euromaidan uprising in 2014. Some go even further than that. I'm mainly here today to talk about what this conflict is doing to working people, what the conflict is doing to working people in Ukraine, in Russia, and even here in the United States. And of course, in Ukraine, the Ukrainian people are facing the worst of it. There's a huge humanitarian crisis. They're being killed and harmed, and it's, a really dire situation that we can only imagine here from our comforts of our homes here in the US. But there's also, of course, a lot of political repression and sanctions that are affecting working people in those states as well, in Ukraine and Russia. So, and for instance, in Russia, hundreds of anti-war protesters have been jailed. In Ukraine, Zelensky has banned pretty much all the left-wing parties, and neo-Nazi groups control the streets in the Ukraine and have formal positions in military and administration, which is pretty frightening and not a good sign for the working classes there. So, there's a lot of other things that are happening as a result of this conflict that we won't know or really figure out the implications of for some time. For instance, there is, going to be probably rising food prices as Ukraine is a main producer of wheat. There's going to be, we're already seeing rising gas prices, and there's some bonanza for oil companies. We're going to see food prices also rise because Russia is a huge producer of fertilizer, about 12% of our fertilizer and potash. We are seeing a really kind of frightening level of censorship here in the US. Just recently, I heard that Chris Hedges' entire RT archive was pulled from YouTube. And, we're going to probably see more of like this kind of censorship Patriot Act redux going on. And what's happening with the global economy as well, that we have to keep track of and think about too. I recently saw that Russia tied its currency, rubles, to gold. That is a more secure currency than a fiat currency, such as US dollars, which is the global reserve. And we could see, in response to the sanctions that we thought were going to hurt Russia, Russia is securing their money, and we could see countries in the future, abandoning the US dollar. What effect will that have on the dollar, potentially devaluing it, potentially more inflation? So there's a lot of shifting of ruling class power and hegemony happening right now, including right here at home, and we're going to see more of them in the future. And we need to pay attention to this and keep light of what working people at the of everyone's mind. It's not possible for us to, for instance, sacrifice for the sake of any kind of time and our living standards, frankly. And so, we have to keep asking ourselves. Like, there was a really good panel just yesterday evening with some labor leaders, such as Carl Rosen and Sarah Nelson, and they asked a really important question that I'm going to, pose again, because I've been thinking about it, and we all need to keep thinking about it. Is who is profiting from this conflict? And what is going on with the ruling class? This is a ruling class conflict. This is not a conflict between working people. All right. I mean, Eugene Debs, I think, said it best back in 1918 when he said, in the Middle Ages, when feudal lords concluded to enlarge their domains, to increase their power, their prestige, and their wealth, they declared war upon one another. But they themselves did not go to war any more than the modern feudal lords, the barons of Wall Street, go to war. So, what is happening with the global oligarchs is not just Russian oligarchs, it's oligarchs in Ukraine, it's oligarchs in the United States, it's oligarchs in the European Union. What is happening? What is that? How is that affecting us? And who's profiting? Obviously, we can see already that oil companies are profiting immensely. The military industrial complex is profiting immensely. Raytheon CEO Greg Hayes, is talking and salivating over the tensions in Eastern Europe in an earnings call. Lockheed Martin CEO is also excited about this conflict and the great power competition, in his words, that is going to benefit his company immensely. And so, this is a conflict among the ruling classes. We have to remember that. And we need to be thinking about, what are they trying to achieve? What is happening? And in terms of solutions, I mean, I'm not an expert in any of this. I'm not a foreign policy expert, but it seems to me that the only solution in terms of saving the most lives and not using Ukrainians as a proxy war against Russia, and at the same time, maybe not capitulating to Russia, is to try to use the US power in NATO, for instance, and other organizations to diffuse tensions, to try to de-escalate and not provide more weapons, because right now we don't know where those weapons are going to end up. There's a long history of US providing weapons in conflicts and giving them to extremist groups in conflicts and having long-term destabilizing effects in those countries. And we cannot risk that with the degree of neo-Nazi activity in Ukraine right now. And I know Russia is using that to a certain extent as a premise for this war, and it's not to justify the war by any means, but it is a problem and we can't ignore it. And I think we should also be petitioning our government's huge role in organizations like the IMF to demand cancellation of Ukraine debt. We are the biggest contributor to the IMF, so we have considerable sway in this organization. And economic instability is what leads to conflicts, oftentimes what leads to the rise in fascism. There's going to be a massive need to rebuild the country after this war is over with. And we need to make it easier, not harder, for them to rebuild and not be saddled with even more debt after this conflict. And we can do that by canceling that debt. And of course, we also need to give as any kind of humanitarian aid and offer refugee resettlement. And I'm glad that we have announced that we're accepting 100,000, I believe, Ukrainian refugees. Absolutely need to do that. At the same time, I think we need to have a broader conversation about why it is that we are so accepting of certain refugees and not others. I think and it's overdue for us to have a conversation about the need to accept refugees from other countries that we have stoked conflicts in, such as Syria, Palestine, and Yemen, to name but a few. And last but not least, I think we really need to demand that our country stop, exacerbating and bringing about conflict in other countries. I was really disappointed by President Biden's words about wanting a regime change in Russia. Of course, I find Putin's actions and the military intervention abhorrent, but I think we have no role in deciding what should happen in terms of that country per se. It's up to the Russian people to decide how they want to deal with their country and the conflict. A lot of them have been standing up against the war, but we need to stop trying to be the cop of the world and try our best to instead facilitate peace and invest our money in people and providing for people's needs instead of killing them in mass numbers for various geopolitical conflicts that only benefit a few.